this kind of equation that Israel and the West are supporting and defending Western values is something I must concede, because, of course, Western values are the values of colonialism and genocide. This is precisely what Europe, especially European liberals, have espoused since the late 18th century and continue to do so throughout the 19th century. The support of so-called racialized democracy in the US while supporting despotism for non-brown and for non-white people, whether brown, black, red, or yellow, is a major hallmark of European liberal thought. And we see this, of course, as continuing today. We know that, of course, West Germany, after its establishment following the World War II, learned nothing from its Nazi past. I have come up with the epithet for it as the Fourth Reich.
Hello, everyone. I'm Rania Khalek, and this is Dispatches. 8 months into Israel's genocide in Gaza, Israel's supporters are getting more desperate than ever in defending their live-streamed mass murder of tens of thousands of civilians. They're trotting out their favorite propaganda points, everything from claiming European roots to the Middle East, to accusing even Israel's softest critics of anti-Semitism, while the West pulls out all the stops to protect its satellite settler colony in Palestine. With Zionism exposed to much of the world for the genocidal savagery its victims always knew defined it, it's becoming clear this project is not only unsustainable, but may be nearing its end. To discuss this and more, I'm joined by Joseph Massad, professor of modern Arab politics and intellectual history at Columbia University, and the author of many books, including The Persistence of the Palestinian Question, Islam and Liberalism, and Desiring Arabs. He also writes a column in Middle East Eye in English and in Arabi 21 in Arabic. But before we jump into it, this is just part of this episode. The full interview is available to Breakthrough News members only. You can become a member at patreon.com/breakthroughnews. And as always, be sure to hit the subscribe button and the bell so you get a notification whenever we post new content. And if you appreciate this show, you can also donate below on YouTube. Joseph, welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, it's an honor to be here.
Well, it's an honor to have you on. And I mean, I'm sure anybody who follows me on social media knows that I am a big proponent of reading Joseph Massad's work. Your work is excellent. Your articles are excellent. Your books are excellent. Your analysis is like no other. So I'm really excited to really dig into it as we enter almost into the 8th month of this horrific genocide in Gaza. And I think a good place to start is, you in one of your articles, and you have repeatedly described Zionism as being a genocidal cult whose savagery is a sign of its impending defeat. I'm quoting you there. So I want to start there. I want to ask you, after what we've seen since October 7th, but I mean, obviously we can say what we've seen since Israel's founding. Do you believe that we're witnessing the end of Zionism?
I believe we are, and I have believed that for quite some time now. My thinking has always been, and of course I'm not alone in this, but generally when you look at white settler colonies, the only ones that have survived are the ones who are successful in absolutely eliminating and annihilating the native population, either completely or basically retaining a small minority of them. These are the only white settler colonies that have survived. We see this in the United States, we see it in Canada, in Australia, and in New Zealand. We see less of that, of course, in other places. In Latin America, of course, there was a lot of intermarriage, and still we have several states where Native Americans continue to be a majority, especially in the Andean states, but also where there are very few sort of large white populations, perhaps outside of Argentina, that dominate. We have more of a mixed population, racially mixed, as the Europeans would say, in a number of these states. So they don't survive in the same way, although they remain settler colonies. It's not in the same way, and we've seen some changes when Evo Morales was perhaps the first Native American to rule any of the settler colonies in the Americas some decade and a half ago. Took place. That was a major event. But Israel, of course, is more like South Africa, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, Morocco, Rhodesia, Angola, Mozambique, Namibia. It's like all of these other settler colonies, including Kenya, for example, whose end we've witnessed since the early 60s and through the mid 1990s. And the reason why these settler colonies were dismantled has to do with the fact that the native population has always outnumbered, or has come to outnumber, the white settler population. This is a situation that Zionism was very much aware of, which is why in 1948, and even before that, they had plans since the 1920s, in fact, concrete plans, that is, to expel the Palestinian population. We know that Zionism had foreseen the necessity of expelling the Palestinians as early as Theodor Herzl, who's written about expelling them, or at least facilitating their removal from the country, as he put it in his diaries, but also in his subsequent writings. But since the 1920s and the 1930s, the Zionists came up with concrete plans on how to bring this about, and certainly starting on the 30th of November 1947, the day after the United Nations had passed the partition plan resolution, they began to put this plan into action and began to expel the Palestinian population. So that while the Palestinians were more than 70% of the population of Palestine, the 30% Jewish settlers, most of whom had arrived in the previous decade and a half from Europe, subsequent to that, they began to expel, the majority of that population. So by the time Israel was finished with the expulsion by December 1948, or at least with the major part of the expulsion, it had successfully evicted more than 90% of the Palestinian population in the territories it was able to establish itself over. This was the only way it was able to become a Jewish majority settler colony, and that, of course, placated the fears and the worries of its Jewish supremacist and racist founders that their settler colony would survive the way the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand had survived. They were concerned, they thought they were in a better situation than South Africa, say, or Algeria, where the settlers were far outnumbered by the indigenous populations, and that there had been in neither of these settler colonies or in others major plans to evict the population. So the Zionists were really quite ahead of their time, in the sense that they thought they were onto something, unlike these other African settler colonies, through the expulsion of the population. The major mistake the Zionists made, of course, or the Israelis made in 1967, is to conquer the remaining part of Palestine, adding to Israel a large number of Palestinians, not only the indigenous populations of the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, but also more than half the refugees that they had expelled in 1948, who had taken refuge and had been living in the areas they conquered. As a result of that, the demographic situation changed considerably in Israel and began to affect the survivability of the settler colony, at least on a demographic basis. However, as the decline in the percentage of Jews in their majority in Palestine continued between 1967 and 1990, with all kinds of predictions since the 1980s that Palestinians would very soon outnumber the Jewish settlers, kind of a great Cold War and imperial gift was given to the Zionists by the triumph of the United States in the Cold War, the subsequent collapse of the Soviet Union, and the immigration of 1 million Soviets, many who claimed to be Jewish, although about 40% of whom subsequently were revealed not to be Jewish according to Judaic or rabbinical criteria. Nonetheless, those 1 million Jewish settlers who came between 1990 and 2000 to Israel had, in many ways, of course, delayed this demographic crisis that Israel was facing. And since then, however, in the last 24 years or so, that advantage disappeared, and the Palestinians began to outnumber Israeli Jews and settlers in their country. I would say even beginning in 2015 or thereabouts, we began to see not only the ascent of the number of Palestinians because of perhaps, as the Israelis are always concerned about, a higher rate of reproduction, but also because of the increasing number of Israeli Jews who began to emigrate outside the country. And indeed, that emigration from Israel, especially to Europe and the United States, increased significantly after the fall of the Soviet Union and the Eastern Socialist camp, because many of these countries now began to actually issue passports to Jewish settlers in Israel whose families had come from these countries. This would include Germany, Poland, Hungary, Romania, but even Spain began to give or grant Sephardi Jews Spanish passports based on the premise that the Jews were, of course, expelled in 1492. But of course, so were Muslim Arabs, although Spain was not as magnanimous in providing passports to them. The reason why this is important is because, of course, Europe is economically far superior in terms of income and sort of standard of living than Israel is. So more than 1 million Israeli Jews, possibly 2 million, applied and received these passports and began to move or spend at least half a year in Europe. And this became a guarantee for them that should Israel's economic, military, security, or any other aspect of its society to fall, they had something very important to fall back on, which is European or American citizenship, which also facilitated their immigration. So this is a very important demographic factor, and why I think Zionism has been sort of, in a way, deteriorating and perhaps approaching its end in the last couple of decades. But what I wanted to say is, of course, the Israelis had become very, very aware of the situation, which is why they decided that the kind of a facade of liberal democracy with which they've surrounded themselves since 1948, wherein, for example, Palestinian citizens of Israel, meaning the 165,000 people who had remained inside the 1948 borders of Israel after the end of the war, who are today upwards of 2.2 million people, those people actually were given the right to vote and Israeli citizenship. Of course, there are upwards of 65 laws that discriminate against them in the country and that uphold Jewish privilege in the country over the rights of non-Jews, even though they are citizens. But nonetheless, as a result of the fact that this minority of Palestinians who were not expelled got some of these rights, Israel could actually, in many ways, cover itself with a kind of a camouflage of liberal democratic rights. However, of course, after 1967, when it acquired a much larger Palestinian population whose territories it conquered, it refused to extend to them suffrage at all, realizing that they would outnumber and outvote Jewish supremacist governments. So, but still, this was one of the reasons why it couldn't annex these territories without being able to expel the population. And there was no opportunity to do so between 1967 and October 6, 2023. So as a result, it couldn't really annex these territories. It tried to expel Palestinians from East Jerusalem, which it successfully did with many thousands of them, which is why it was able to annex it, but not the rest of the territories. As a result of that, by 2018, Israel was unable to sustain this leaf of democratic liberalism and decided to legislate a new law, the so-called nation-state law, which explicitly stated, basically, that Jews have exclusive rights to the land of Israel, or to the state of Israel, and they are the only part of the Israeli citizenship that has the exclusive right to self-determination inside the state of Israel. What that meant was, knowing that Israeli Jews are becoming a minority and will increasingly become more of a minority, suddenly there was a need for an explicit law to state that they will continue to have differential privileges and rights over non-Jews in Israel, lest the Palestinians think that if they became a majority, they would be able to outvote them. So we begin to see a transformation in the image that Israel was projecting. We saw that many of the pro-Zionist Western leaders and the extremely pro-Zionist Western media, including the New York Times, being highly concerned about the explicitness of this new law and subsequent legal and institutional procedures that the Israelis were taking, because they couldn't help Israel in Western coverage cover up its increasing racism. In addition to that, of course, there's the increasing internal disagreements between two major sections of the Jewish electorate, namely the fanatical fundamentalist Zionist Jewish citizens and the fanatical secularist Zionist Jewish citizens over the way the country should be run juridically. We know this has been an ongoing battle between the secular and the fundamentalist parts of the electorate since 1948. As we know, the fundamentalist and religious Jewish political parties insisted in 1948 that Israel abide by Jewish law in terms of the Jewish state would not, for example, serve non-kosher food, that the Sabbath would be a holiday, and things of that sort. And as a result, of course, Israel until today does not even have a constitution, because were it to do so, it would have to incorporate some of the halachic religious Jewish law in it, which would alienate many of its secular citizens. Now, as a result of this battle, since then, of course, also Israel does not have, for example, civil marriage. So each religious community, its religious affairs, its marriage and divorce are run by its own religious authorities. So for Jews, and the only denomination of Judaism that is recognized in Israel is Orthodox Judaism. Reform Judaism and Conservative Judaism are not recognized. So Orthodox Judaism's, the marriage and divorce of Jewish citizens is governed by Jewish law, just as for Muslims also inside Israel, it's governed by Muslim law, and for the different Christian Palestinian denominations by their own churches. So as a result, of course, the fundamentalist religious electorate today, which clearly is a majority that has been bringing to power more and more fundamentalist and right-wing religious political parties, has had a long presence in Israel. This is not new at all. However, increasingly, there's been an attempt by the Netanyahu government to bring about even more changes in the laws that would affect the rights of secular fanatical Zionist Jewish citizens in Israel, which precipitated a large number of demonstrations, a larger opposition to these policies, which preceded the subsequent genocidal war which Israel declared and launched against the Palestinians on October 7th.
I think it's so important that people understand, because what you just gave are very material reasons why the Israelis behave and do what they do. Because oftentimes I think it's seen as, oh, Israel's just like a crazy, irrational state. I mean, there is some level of irrationality to some of the behavior and rhetoric of some Israeli leaders, because they make themselves look very stupid on the international stage. But as far as policies towards Palestinians goes, there is a reason the Israelis are trying to eliminate as many Palestinians as possible in Gaza. They have a demographic problem. There's a reason they're constantly doing what they do in Jerusalem, Judaizing neighborhoods and kicking people out, because they have a demographic problem. And it goes on and on and on. And it's an existential crisis for this country. And you just laid out how. And I'm curious, Israel basically has to commit these horrific levels of violence in order to continue to exist as a Zionist colony, right? As a result, you see things like the ICC potential arrest warrants, the ICJ rulings coming out. Now you see, which is something you recently wrote about as just a very symbolic thing that's sort of meaningless, but you see these European countries recognizing a Palestinian state, whatever that means at this point. All that's to say this is a part of a sort of increasing pariah status of Israel. So I'm curious if you think these sorts of measures, even if they don't really have any teeth, actually mean something when taken together at this point?
Well, I mean, let me also put Israel in the context of other settler colonies during their last years, right? So I don't think what Israel is doing is necessarily irrational. I do think there is perhaps a level of heightened concern and worry, perhaps some desperation. We've heard some predictions by Israeli officials, including Netanyahu, over the last 5-6 years, saying we're not sure Israel will survive to its 80th birthday or to its 100th birthday. And this is long before what unfolded after October 7th. So there's been that kind of worry about all these internal fissures, the demographic contraction of Israel, and the fact that there's no new pool from which to draw on. I mean, the 6 million or so American Jews have never shown an interest, or at least never has there been a large percentage of American Jewry that showed an interest in moving to Israel. Not at all. Even though today, for example, American Jewish settlers in Israel, I think, are upwards of, 10% of the population. But generally, the majority of American Jews, have chosen to remain in their own country, in the United States. While many of them may support Israel, others don't. And even those, we've seen sort of over the last 30 years, there's been a lot of polls, for example, about how many American Jews had even visited Israel. Usually the polls tell us that about half of the American Jewry had visited Israel, the majority of whom visited it as part of a tour of the region that included Egypt or Jordan. So a general sort of American tourism. So we don't, despite the political support that private American Jewish organizations who don't necessarily represent American Jews might give to Israel, and despite the fact that even many individual Jews may be supportive of Israel, that does not mean that they are Zionists or they're going to move to Israel. So the only two remaining possibilities for the Israelis to bring in more Jews are the small community in France and in Argentina. They've been partially successful in both areas, but even if they're able to bring in and to convince all French Jews and Argentinian Jews to come to Israel, their numbers are so minuscule that they won't be able to offset this demographic crisis. But now, having said that, what I want to say is also the mass murder and genocidal policies of the Israeli government are not necessarily irrational. They may be desperate in a certain way, in the sense that they must teach the Palestinians a lesson never to actually resist Israel again. So the issue is not only to eliminate them physically and demographically, but also to forestall the possibility of resistance in the future. We see this kind of behavior that I think is quite rational, followed by many of the settler colonial countries. We see this, for example, by the British in Kenya, which was one of their last major settler colonies in Africa. Between the 50s and the early 60s, when Kenya received its independence, the British killed upwards of 100,000 Kenyans. The atrocities committed there were appalling. They used to even barbecue Mau Mau guerrilla members alive. This is, of course, British, European, and Enlightenment values. We see, for example, the Portuguese, South Africa, and the US, in order to forestall the independence of the Portuguese settler colonies of Angola and Mozambique, killing upwards of 1.5 million Mozambicans and Angolans between 1962 and 2000, basically a huge number to end the possibility of a revolt at the end of the settler colony. We see that also in places like South Africa. Between 1989 and 1994, the South African white regime, as it was negotiating the end of apartheid, killed upwards of 15,000 black people during that period. The Israelis themselves, since 1993, meaning after the Oslo Accords were signed with the Palestine Liberation Organization, through October 6, 2023, killed upwards of 12,000 Palestinians. Of course, we're not counting anywhere between 36 and 45,000 Palestinians who'd been killed since October 7th, let alone the about 90,000 Palestinians injured since then. But the point is, this heightened level of murder and genocidal murder at that is actually is a desperate attempt, but not an irrational one, to force the Palestinians to stop resisting and to accept their fate. And we see this as a practice that was followed in other separate colonies. As for the decisions, those that were taken or upcoming ones by the International Criminal Court or the International Court of Justice, in both cases, of course, these are welcome. We've seen similar decisions taken, for example, in the case of Namibia in the early 1970s, calling on South Africa to remove its occupation forces. The South Africans, of course, refused till 1990. Nonetheless, they have symbolic value, and they do have the advantage of isolating not only Israel, but also the United States and those pro-genocide European countries that continue to support Israel come what may. Of course, foremost among them is Germany, followed by Britain and France. So there is an important isolationist advantage of these decisions of Israel and its major allies, and the fact that it has gone back to its status in the 60s and 70s as a pariah state, which it had sort of overcome after the collapse of the Soviet Union between 1990 and 2020. So for about 30 years, it was able to exit this pariah state status, which it has now re-entered with a vengeance, I believe.
So I want to zoom out a little bit and ask you about that support from these pro-genocide Western states. You know, these Western countries led by, of course, the US, as well as many of those in Europe that you mentioned, they've offered this unconditional support to Israel and its genocide in Gaza, which, I mean, isn't necessarily surprising. They always offer pretty unconditional support to the Israelis. But, you know, you've argued that this is not unique or exceptional. And then I'm just going to quote you here. You wrote in one of your Middle East eye pieces that the West views its survival as Europe and the US's last stand in support of racism and settler colonialism outside of their borders and against the barbaric hordes of non-Europeans resisting colonial rule and determined to overthrow it. And you also put it in the context of a colonial tradition, some of which you described that's founded in this kind of vengeance against the colonized for daring to revolt militarily, that's neither unique or exceptional. Do you think the West's support for this genocide is also, much like, you know, one of the reasons Israel's carrying it out, is also part of a kind of punishment for the military successes of October 7th, as well as a kind of lesson for the rest of the global South as we emerge into an increasingly, you know, more potentially multipolar order where there is an anxiety in the West about a sort of decline and being overshadowed by the global South?
Well, I mean, yes, I do believe it is can only be explained in the context of ongoing Western support historically, and I mean today for Israel, but also ongoing Western support for settler colonies during their last days to prevent their fall. We've seen this in the Western support for Algeria, for French Algeria and the French in Algeria. We've seen this in the attempts also to support France during its occupation and colonization of Tunisia and Morocco. We've seen this in the support given to Britain in Kenya. We've seen it in the support that was given to the white settler colonists in Rhodesia, certainly in South Africa. I mean, the Americans, until sort of the mid-1980s, were the largest trade partner. The British, West Germany, and the United States had the largest investments in white South Africa. The American support for the Portuguese and the South African war on the guerrillas in Angola and Mozambique continued till 2000 in the case of Angola, until 1990 in the case of Mozambique. So yes, I mean the U.S., as you know, went in immediately to support France after its defeat at Dien Bien Phu in Vietnam in 1854, and continued the war at the behest of the French and then independently until 1975. So there is nothing special about the ongoing support for Israel, especially, of course, I mean, ideologically, as we've seen, the president of Israel, Herzog, had sort of regaled us with stories of how Israel is defending Western civilization and that were to fall, Europe would be next. He said this explicitly. We have also heard recently from the German president or head of the European Union, who told us that Jewish values of Israel, that is not Jewish values more generally, are European values. We've also heard similar accounts from the European Union's major sort of commissioner on fighting anti-Semitism, who tells us that also European culture is Jewish culture, by which she means Zionist culture. Remember, these are all anti-Semitic claims because Christian Europe has always been built on the decimation and the erasure of Judaism and Jewish culture. So to suddenly claim that Zionist Israeli Jewish culture is part of Europe is not actually a concession to Judaism, but to Zionist colonialism. It's not a concession to Jewishness, but a concession to colonialist policies. So this is important to remember. But this kind of equation that Israel and the West are supporting and defending Western values is something I must concede, because, of course, Western values are the values of colonialism and genocide. This is precisely what Europe, especially European liberals, have espoused since the late 18th century and continued to do so throughout the 19th century. The support of so-called racialized democracy in the US while supporting despotism for non-brown and for non-white people, whether brown, black, red, or yellow, is a major sort of hallmark of European liberal thought. And we see this, of course, as continuing today. We know that, of course, West Germany, after its establishment following the World War II, learned nothing from its Nazi past. I have come up with the epithet for it as the Fourth Reich, and I think it has continued to be that after Germany was unified in 1990. So this is a government that has upheld, in fact, continued to be staffed by ex-Nazis and upheld Nazi racialism, except with regards to Jews. I mean, and I've said this before in interviews and I've written about this, that the kind of regret that you see European countries, including especially West Germany and unified Germany's purported love for European Jews and their regret over the Holocaust, is based on this discovery that they made after World War II, that Jews turned out to be white people. So they had mistaken them for non-white people, which is why they committed that horrific genocide against them that materialized in the Holocaust. But now that they've realized after the 1950s that there was a mistake and Jews were actually white Europeans, they've regretted that. So the regret was not that you should not kill people who are different from you. The regret is expressed that you should not kill people that are just like you, meaning white Europeans, which Jews subsequent to the Holocaust and in the 1950s began to be reintegrated in Europe at the level of cultural value. However, the belief that non-white people should continue to be killed was never questioned. We've seen this, of course, in European colonial policies since World War II and the ongoing genocides, from Algeria and Vietnam, and in the case of France, to what the US had done from Korea to Vietnam, Central Africa, Southern Africa, Central and South America, etc. What the Portuguese had done, etc. And of course, the Germans have never shown as much regret over the Holocausts in Tanganyika and in Namibia before World War I. They've recently sort of made some apologies to Namibia, but nothing more than that. This is why today you see most of the support coming the way of the Palestinians, coming precisely from people who have suffered under European settler colonialism. South Africa and Namibia have been in the forefront of supporting the Palestinians and in condemning Israeli genocide that is ongoing today. The only people who defend that genocide, of course, are Germany, the European Union, and the United States, either settler colonies or colonizing countries who had set up settler colonies previously. So in that sense, I think the support that the United States and the West more generally have given and continue to give to Israel is part and parcel of their ongoing support for white supremacy in their own countries and elsewhere. But Israel is, of course, the last sort of European supremacist settler colony that remains in Asia and Africa, that continues to rule with a battery of racist laws, upwards of 6 laws, maybe 65 to 66 laws on the latest count. Now, in terms of the kind of support that Israeli genocide of the Palestinians is obtaining in these colonial, settler, and white supremacist quarters, yes, it is part of a kind of vengeance that inferior races have arrogated to themselves the right or the ability to kill or resist white supremacy and European supremacy. We see this, for example, and I tried to position this in the history of colonialism. Perhaps the major example goes back to 1879, when the Zulu army defeated the British and killed upwards of 1,300 Brits while the British were trying to conquer Zululand, only for the British a few months later in July 1879 to bring a much larger army, conquer Zululand, destroy basically the capital of the Zulu kingdom, Ulundi at the time, and kill 10,000 Zulus to exact revenge and teach them a lesson for having killed their betters and their superiors. We see this also, such horrific massacres in revenge in the 1890s. The revenge is we have come and colonized your country, you should be thankful. If you resist us, we have to avenge ourselves. Meaning your resistance is not really a form of vengeance or retaliation against our colonization, but if our response to your resistance is retaliatory. So we see this with the Rhodesian white settlers who massacred hundreds and thousands of native and indigenous Africans in the area that would become Rhodesia in the 1890s, and committed atrocious acts of physical mutilations and rapes. We see this also something that the Italians have done when they lost in the Battle of Adwa to the Ethiopian army in 1896 and were humiliated before their European peers. They avenged themselves through Mussolini's 1935 invasion of Ethiopia, which killed upwards of 70,000 Ethiopians and transformed Ethiopia into an Italian settler colony. We see this again. The British did something similar in Sudan. The British were defeated in 1885 in Sudan by the Mahdi. They decided again to go back and with a larger army and conquer Sudan 13 years later in 1898, killing 12,000 Sudanese in order to take it over. And even though al-Mahdi had died of natural causes before then, they went and decapitated his body, and there was an attempt to use his skull as an ink pot on the desk of the British colonial officer in Sudan. We see this also something that the Spanish would do, and the French in Morocco. The Abdul Karim al-Khattabi, who declared the Reef Republic in 1921, had fought off the Spanish colonists, killing thousands of them, and established an independent republic, perhaps the first Arab independent republic in the Arab world, only for a combined force of the Spanish and the French to attack the republic in 1926, killing tens of thousands of Moroccans at the time, mutilating their bodies, raping their women, and of course destroying the Reef Republic and reoccupying that part of Morocco. So Algeria, of course, is the cause célèbre of French atrocities, especially if we want to speak about after World War II from 1945 onwards, where any uprising by the Algerian natives against their cruel and sadistic French settlers would be met with massive murders of tens of thousands of Algerians, so much so that between 1954 and 1962, upwards of 300,000 Algerians were killed by the French. So this kind of quest for vengeance, this racist quest for vengeance, and to teach those inferior races a good lesson for having actually resisted their betters and exacted victims from amongst them is actually a war strategy. It's not only an irrational response. It is, of course, a savage war. It is a racist one. It is genocidal, but I don't think it's irrational.
So, I think that's such a good way to put it. And there's a topic I'm really excited to actually discuss with you here, Joseph, and that is, you were talking about Europeans not learning from what they did during the Holocaust, obviously, particularly the Germans who kind of stayed Nazis, and how they adopted or decided that, Jews actually in Europe are white now. They consider them white. And I'm the reason I like the way you portrayed that is not just because it's factual, but also it speaks to a kind of projection that we hear from Europeans about the Holocaust. It's almost sometimes the way they talk about it. It's as if like the Middle Eastern Arabs and Muslims are the ones who carried out the Holocaust. And the reason I raise that, and the reason I'm excited to talk to you about this topic I'm going to raise now, is that, Zionists like to argue that Zionism is in fact not white supremacy because there are many Arab Jews, right? Which they call Mizrahim in what is considered present-day Israel. And Zionists also insist that the Arab countries kicked all of these Jews out over the decades since Israel's creation because of just virulent anti-Semitism that resembles that of European Nazis. So I'm curious if I want to open the topic on this because it's a common talking point. So Joseph, can you explain the actual history here? How did so many Arab Jews end up in what is now called Israel? Is it because the Arab and Muslim majority countries just suddenly turned into Nazis? And I mean, that's a rhetorical question because that's not what happened. And also, how has the European settler colony of Israel treated them and erased their history?
This is a large topic, but I want to make perhaps add a footnote to what I said earlier about the transformation of European Jews from Semites or an inferior race in the eyes of European racists into whites who didn't deserve to be killed because they were white. A realization that dawned on ex-German Nazis and Europeans after World War II. We see this also encouraged, for example, in Hollywood films. Remember, the majority of the 6 million Jews who were killed during World War II were poor East European Jews, poor and religious. However, we see the depiction of Jews in Hollywood films about the Holocaust, usually, like as in West European, white-looking, urban, highly educated, secular Jews playing piano, speaking Western languages, etc. The idea is to also say that these European Jews looked like all European Christians, which is why they didn't deserve to die. But of course, they're hardly ever represented. The majority of Jews who are poor and religious are hardly ever represented in these Holocaust films, lest they be seen by European anti-Semites as different from themselves even during that period. So the point of trying to erase the history of European anti-Jewish racism and anti-Semitism is precisely by trying to erase the difference that these racists had registered between a certain vision or idea or depiction, fictional as it was, of European Christians and European Jews. Having said that, let me try to answer your very large question on the question of Arab Jews. Of course, a lot of these things are Zionist fabrications. There has never been a single order to expel any Arab Jews from any Arab country since 1948. That simply didn't happen. In fact, the opposite has happened, and I will tell you a few things about that. First of all, after 1948, the League of Arab States, in fact, issued instructions to all Arab countries to pass laws to prevent Arab Jews from going to Israel or from immigrating to Israel. So, in fact, subsequent immigration of Arab Jews from different Arab countries to Israel was against the law. We see this perhaps most spectacularly in the case of Yemen, but also Iraq and then Egypt and Morocco, Tunisia, or even Algeria. First of all, let me say that the majority of Algerian Jews left with Algerian French Christian settlers with kind of countdown to independence, despite calls upon them by the FLN, the Algerian National Liberation Front, to remain as compatriots and equal citizens. Remember, Algerian Jews were transformed by the French in 1870. At the time, the Justice Minister of France, Adolphe Crémieux, had granted Algerian Jews French citizenship so as to render Algerians all Muslims. So suddenly Algerian Jews were taken out of the Algerian status of colonized people and were given the rights of the French settlers, and as a result began to be integrated into French colonial society. And of course, this is why it was easy for them to leave to France. And they left to France long before Algerian independence, so under the French administration. Moroccan and Tunisian Jews also left Tunisia and Morocco during the French occupation in the case of Tunisia, and the French and Spanish occupation in Morocco, not under the independent governments that came to power after 1956. And we know that, there's already been a lot of history of how Moroccan Jews were tricked or sometimes forced to go on ships with the collusion of French and Spanish officials and the Zionists to be taken against their will through Marseille to Israel and then prevented from going back. But the big stories usually are the stories of the large communities in Yemen, in Iraq, and in the smaller one in Egypt. In Yemen, of course, that was at the time ruled by a pro-Western ruler by the name of Imam Ahmed, who at the time was basically allowed Zionist envoys to come in. And because the country was not highly centralized, the Zionists would go into different regions and try to bribe the rulers of those regions to allow the Jews to immigrate, which was against the law. But many also refused, and according to the letters written by Mossad agents who wrote back to their handlers saying, many of the Yemeni Muslim leaders say, we cannot allow you to take the Jews away from Yemen. We are obligated by our religion and law to protect them as sort of the people of the book. But indeed, so they tried to, in many ways, go around these objections to bring about the exodus of Yemeni Jews who left as a result of these Zionist machinations. The big scandal, of course, has always been that of Iraqi Jews. Iraqi Jews had been historically anti-Zionist, as were their rabbis. They were represented in all classes, like Muslim and Christian Iraqis. Indeed, some of them were ministers in the governments of Iraq under the British Mandate. However, after 1948, of course, as I said, in other Arab countries, as in Iraq, laws were legislated to ban the possibility of Arab Jewish immigration to Israel. At the time, Iraq was applying for a loan from the World Bank. The Americans and the Israelis began to influence the World Bank decision to give that loan to Iraq, and that they would not give them that loan unless the Iraqi parliament would pass a law to unban Iraqi Jewish immigration to Israel. At the time, Iraq, of course, was run by the Iraqi strongman who was a British agent, Nouri Saeed, who collaborated basically on this issue and finally had Parliament issue or unban the immigration. The Zionist envoys who wrote back to the Mossad would say, we're about to win in Parliament and to bring about what we have worked for the previous 2 years. They did that, however, to encourage Iraqi Jewish immigration. The Mossad planted several explosives in different cafes and libraries frequented by Jews. They were set to go off at night. One of them went off early, killing, I think, a couple of people and injuring a third, which of course sent panic waves in the Jewish community, thinking that it was Muslims or Christian Iraqis who were targeting them, and many began to leave the country. Of course, the parliament had legislated that those Arab Jews wishing to leave would lose their Iraqi nationality and could not take their property with them, meaning they would arrive in Israel destitute, which many scholars believe was actually worked out with the Israelis so that the Iraqi Jews would arrive in Israel penniless and become working class, serving the Ashkenazi community in Israel, as many Arab Jewish historians of that exodus and of the Iraqi Jewish community in Israel have taught us. In the case of Egypt, which had a small community, I mean, Iraq had about 130,000 Jews. Basically, it was emptied of its Jews in a matter of a few weeks in 1950-51. But in the case of Egyptian Jews, there was about 60 to 65,000 Jews. Half of them were not Egyptian citizens. They were either foreign nationals or they were stateless holders of laissez-passés or travel documents. Now, the rich amongst them decided to leave in 1948 as a result of the Zionist conquest of Palestine. There began to, of course, arise anti-Jewish sentiment in the country, but mostly it was anti-European. So some European Jewish businesses, like European Christian businesses, were attacked or burned down in some demonstrations in Egypt during that period. However, the major exodus of Egyptian Jews would take place in 1954. The Israelis were able to recruit about 9 or 10 Egyptian Jews as terrorists and spies for them. This scandal would come to be known as the Lavon affair, after the Israeli minister Yitzhak Lavon, who had engineered it, wherein some of these terrorists were to plant explosives in Egyptian cinemas, in the major train station in Cairo, in different other post offices in Alexandria and in Cairo. Again, one of the explosives went off early and injured one of the terrorists, who was captured and told on the rest of the cell, all of whom were captured by the Egyptian authorities. And then, of course, they had a public trial. The Nasser regime was explicit in its directives and announcements to the population that a distinction has to always be made between Zionists and Egyptian Jews, that these were Zionists, even though they were Jewish, they're not the same as Egyptian Jews. Nonetheless, of course, public sentiment began to be very hostile to Egyptian Jews, which brought about the exodus of a large number also of the upper class and the middle class who went to France or to the Bay Area in the United States. It was in 1956 when, in collusion with France and Britain, Israel invaded Egypt in what came to be known as the tripartite invasion, or what the West calls the Suez War, that had elicited a much larger and final exodus of Egyptian Jews from the country. The poor amongst them could not reach France or the United States and ended up in Israel. The Israeli propaganda line usually is that in 1956, the Egyptian regime expelled Jews. That's not true. The Egyptian regime, as in all other regimes or governments during wartime, did deport all holders of British as well as French nationality, and if I'm not mistaken, also Belgian nationality, who are participants in the war as enemy nationals. So those Jews who held, like other Christians, British or French nationalities were deported from the country. But there was never a deportation order for Egyptian Jews or for Jews who held non-enemy nationalities. That's utterly untrue. And indeed, some would say that Egyptian Jewish property was nationalized. That's not true. In the 1950s, the Nasser government had what was called then an Egyptianization campaign to Egyptianize a lot of the businesses that were owned by foreigners, which meant that these foreigners had time to actually sell their properties to Egyptians. Usually, a big propaganda lie is that the Shikurel family, a Sephardi family that originated in Turkey, who had come to Egypt after World War I and owned one of the largest department stores, the Shikurel department store, left because its store had been nationalized. It was not. In fact, Shikurel sold the business at a very good price to Al-Gabri Muslim family in Egypt. Subsequently, after 58, a lot of these businesses were nationalized. When the Shikurel department store was nationalized, it was owned by a Muslim family and not by the Shikurel family who had sold it and left to Britain or to France. So the point of this is that None of this is actually true. Most of the Jews who left Arab countries either left during the British or French or Spanish rule, or if they left after independence, they left of their own accord as a result of Israeli direct intervention in their lives that had upended their lives until then. And these stories, of course, can multiply on a smaller scale elsewhere. As far as their treatment in Israel, as soon as they arrived, of course, they were placed in refugee camps. The Ashkenazi European Jews were given the homes of the expelled Palestinian population, as well as their lands, the better lands of the Palestinians. By the time the Arab Jews were brought in, they were given substandard housing, if at all, and the lesser fertile land to set up on them some agricultural cooperatives, especially as the kibbutzim, which were sort of a master race socialism for Ashkenazim only, had the best land and Arab Jews could not join them. So we begin to see, in fact, the discrimination against them in education, in employment, even in subsidies. For example, European Ashkenazi bread would be subsidized by the government, but not Arab bread. When Iraqi bakers wanted to make Iraqi bread, they refused to give them subsidized flour, and they would have had to actually buy the expensive flour to make it because that was not subsidized. That was not considered part of the national or Jewish bread. So something as trivial as that became a problem. The educational system would discriminate against them. They would discriminate against them even based on their proper pronunciation of Hebrew, as opposed to the Germanic and Russian pronunciation of Hebrew of the East European and West European Jews, which became the standard pronunciation in the country, with a couple of exceptions. Which took on a certain Sephardi pronunciation of the language, what is called the Mil'al Milra syllabic system, and the pronunciation of the letter Tov in Hebrew, which the Sephardim pronounced as Tov, and the Ashkenazim as Sov. Aside from these two concessions, all the other so-called Semitic sounds in Hebrew, like the Ayin, like the Ha, like the Qaf, none of these, of course, is pronounced today by Ashkenazim in Israel, even though some of the Mizrahim continue to pronounce them and, of course, are looked down upon for pronouncing them correctly, as opposed to in a European, East European or Central European fashion. Of course, they would be blamed even in 1977 for the election of the right-wing Likud government. Ashkenazi liberals would say, oh, these horrible Arab Jews who grew up in a despotic and dictatorial Arab world support Likud, which is dictatorial, because of their Arab tradition. Of course, the Arab Jews had to remind them that all the Arab Jews who grew up in the Arab world and came to Israel in 1949 to 55 had voted Labor until 1977. It was their children who grew up in Israel who seemed to love and support Likud in 1977. But of course, liberal Zionist racism toward the Mizrahim has always been immense. If anything, liberal Zionists may be more accommodating to liberal Palestinians like the PA than they had been to more radical voices in the Mizrahi community that called the Ashkenazi racists on their racism. Indeed, many Mizrahi intellectuals refer to Israel as the Ashkenazi state, right, as a result of the ongoing discriminatory practices against them and the insistence that Israel is a European country, should be a European country, should carry what they call European culture and values.
Wow, that was a really, really, really good explanation. But it's important. No, but it's so important because it's not just, I mean, it's a propaganda point that the Israelis always also bring out, but it's also important to recognize how much Israel remade the entire region. I mean, it sectarianized the region. It literally took some of the oldest communities in certain places out and brought them into this settler colony and then erased their histories and basically projected European history onto them. While also doing putting on all these like racist tropes onto these people that you just explained, who at the end of the day have far more in common to the Palestinians they've been brought in to replace than these Europeans who claim to be superior to them. And that just speaks to the level of anti-Semitism that's inherent to Zionism. And I know that we don't have all the time to maybe get to everything I wanted to, but something I definitely want to ask you about, because I think it's so important, and you've written about this a lot, is Jewish anti-Zionism in particular. In a piece that you wrote titled "Jewish Opposition to Israel is as Old as Zionism Itself," you say that European and American Jews have been at the forefront of opposition to Zionism since its birth as a colonial settler movement at the end of the 19th century. And I think this is very significant and important to highlight, because the US and Israel are trying to make Jews and Jewishness the face of this genocide and the Zionist project more generally. And of course, that's why I need to bring on somebody of Palestinian Arab descent to defend Jewishness from the anti-Semitism inherent to Zionism. But in all seriousness, can you talk about that? Can you talk about the fact that, or I guess, can you briefly explain Jewish anti-Zionism historically, and then its ongoing existence today, and of course the Zionist reaction to anti-Zionist Jews, which is basically kind of genocidal at this point in and of itself? If you enjoyed this episode and want to hear the rest, you can access it by becoming a Breakthrough News member at patreon.com/breakthrough news.